start by saying apologies for no broadcast last Sunday. I was out of it. I was quite sick. I was in bed for a couple of days actually, and I had to cancel my birthday party. I missed the lunch and something else as well. But anyway, I'm back and happy to be with you this morning. We are busy with Exodus through ancient eyes. We're taking our time to walk slowly through the book of Exodus, trying to find out how ancient Israelites would have thought about this book, what some of the imagery in the book would have meant for them. And we're doing all of this because we're trying to get away from projecting our assumptions and our expectations, modern day assumptions and expectations upon the book of Exodus. And because the moment we start doing that, we enter dangerous ground, because we can make it say whatever we want it to say. So we're trying our best. And basically in these sessions, I'm bringing you as I said, we're basing it on a book, but also this book is by a respected scholar. So what you're getting from these sessions would be a general scholarly consensus, and not from an apologetic standpoint, but from people that make it their life's work to understand these texts and work through them, and have been educated to do so as well. So I'm kind of like a middleman for those who are too lazy to read for themselves. All right, so last week we spoke about the 10 plagues. We had a look at the fact that we have 3 versions of the 10 plagues in our Hebrew Bible, which already tells us that, well, let me just say this, they're quite different. They don't all have 10 plagues in them. Some have less, some have more, and they don't have the same plagues as well, which immediately gives us a little heads up that we're possibly not dealing with a strict historical account, but rather a more literary type of work. Secondly, we noticed that the plagues are highly structured. The 3 times 3 cycle, plus then the final plague. And then lastly, we said that according to, and I want to read this quickly again, Exodus 12:12, which seems to be a very key verse, because it is quite counterintuitive for modern people to read this verse and just read it for what it says. Here it is, right? For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. So this is God speaking and the authors are writing this down, right? He said, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. And then semicolon, and it adds this little portion here, which, it shouldn't be there. And it's this: on all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. Now, we don't expect this to be here. It doesn't fit our modern view of the Israelites' view of God. For us, the Israelites did not, well, most of us Pentecostal, charismatic type of Christian types, we struggle with the idea that the ancient Israelites believed in other gods. But these type of verses only really make sense if we assume that they did. But more than that here, God is saying, according to the author, that all this process, the plagues coming, his judgments upon the Egyptians, Pharaoh, for not letting the Israelites go, all of this can also be understood as judgments on the gods of Egypt. Right. So this is what scholars will call the mythic element, because it is a higher level of understanding what's happening on the floor. So although on the floor, terrestrially, you might see some grasshoppers and frogs and bloody water, etc. What's really happening above that, excuse me, some people would say in the spiritual realm, is we have a war of Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, against the gods of the Egyptians. Now, this is not nice to hear. It makes us feel uncomfortable, but this is the perspective that the ancient Israelites held about this encounter. It was more than just some plagues hitting earth. It was about God judging the gods. All right. So this is a pretty important piece. And as we then we had a look at this last time, that some of the plagues would have resembled a direct blow to some of the gods of Egypt. I'm not going to go through all of that again, but it is becoming clear, and seems to be quite clear to scholars that there's a mythic element to this, and this is the cosmic battle between the gods. So it's not just a battle between Egyptians and Israelites, or between Moses and Pharaoh, but it's really a proxy war to some degree between Yahweh, a newcomer god, at least for Pharaoh, um, and his mighty gods that have allowed him to become the most powerful person in the ancient Near East, probably at this time. All right, so today we're going to move on. We ran through some of the plagues last time, but today we're going to be having a quick look at the 10th. Yeah, we had a short disconnection there on the internet. So we're going to run this on data for now. So this portion we're dealing with today is Exodus 11 to 13, verse 16. And in this portion, we get introduced to the 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn. And then we also get introduced to the idea of the Passover meal and the festival of unleavened bread. So what is really interesting about this portion is it seems to be quite a bit jumbled up. Seems to be quite a lot of jumping around, 2 or 3 times speaking about the Passover meal and the festival of the unleavened bread. And of course, this, as we've said so many times, raises a question on whether we're not just really dealing with 2 traditions that have been preserved by the writers. So let's have a look at that today. And then we're going to speak briefly about the idea that God requires the firstborn of the Egyptians, but in some way also that of the Israelites, because they have to do something, put the blood on the doorpost, otherwise their firstborn will die as well. So we're going to be talking about those 2 things mainly today. Right, so this section of Exodus, a little bit confusing, deals with 3 topics as I've mentioned them. So the writer doesn't lay it out nicely in order like you would expect a single author to do. He puts it in a narrative structure, and it's very difficult to make sense of it. Let's have a quick look at this. In Exodus 11, 1 to 10, the 10th plague is announced, right? And then comes the regulations for the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. This is in 12, 1 to 20. Then it's followed by another set of regulations for the Passover, 12, 21 to 28. But this time not for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Next, we head into a brief account of the 10th plague itself, 12, 29 to 32. Then it's followed up by the initial departure to Sukkoth, which is technically still Egypt, and that's 12:33 to 42. Then we loop back for a third time. My creepy making a terrible noise there. Then we loop back for a third time for more on the Passover, chapter 12:43 to 50. Followed then finally by a second Festival of Unleavened Bread section, 13:3 to 10. And that's sandwiched between the consecration of the firstborn, which is found in 12:1 to 2, and then 13:11 to 16. So as you can see, the narrative plays out in such a way that the information seems quite a bit jumbled up. It just seems slightly unlikely that a single author would write things in such a, it feels disorganized if you read it for yourself, and I would encourage that you do. Exodus 11 to 13. I noticed it when I used to read it. I was like, why in the world do they do write it so disjointly? And I think now I kind of realize what's really going on here. So to do a quick summary of Exodus 11 verse 1 to 13 verse 16, it goes something like this. It starts at the 10th plague. It goes to the Passover, and then to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then it goes back to the Passover, and then to the 10th plague, and then it goes to the departure. But then it jumps back to the Passover and to the consecration of the firstborn. And then another pass at the Festival of Unleavened Bread gets inserted in the middle. What in the world is going on here? Why is it so disjointed? It looks like we're dealing with 2 traditions here that have been woven together. As we've said previously, sometimes these multiple traditions are woven together. Sometimes they are more concisely not woven together, but added in chronological order. It just depends on how the writer does these things. But in this case, it seems like it's one of those cases where things are woven, much like the flood account, woven together. Right. Um, uh, Now we're going to try, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the author does spend quite a bit of time on creating some order to the mixture of these traditions. And to show how the two traditions might have been woven together. So scholars spend their life doing these type of things. The things Christians, well, I mean, not say Christians, but us normal people, we don't really spend too much time there. It's not that important to us. I have a little chart here, which unfortunately I can't just flash on the screen, but I might give you maybe it's not even worth showing it to you, but basically a little Excel chart in which we have two traditions, A and B, showing the chronological order of the narrative of Exodus 11 to 13, and possibly how the author jumps between the two traditions. And what the point is that it produces basically for us three separate sections on regulations of the Passover and two separate sections of regulations on the unleavened bread. And so we just become aware of that. Reading the sections from tradition A, we call them A and B, without the tradition from section B makes perfect sense and flows nicely and neatly when we read them directly after one another. And this is one of the ways in which scholars try to reconstruct what is from tradition A and what is from tradition B. If we take out tradition B, that was woven into the text, if we take it out, this one should read like there's no disjointedness. It should read nicely and smoothly, as if it was one tradition or one oral version that was placed there. And then it starts getting disjointed when the author basically opens up this one and starts inserting the second tradition where he thinks it should be. Now, obviously, sometimes what happens is the author has to use his discretion on how he is going to put the redactor, we can call him the editor, on how we will put these things together. All right. So it's because of this way of weaving together that we get the repetition and even some tension sometimes between the two visions of the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and particularly their regulations. However, and here's the real point, the editor valued both of these traditions, and he felt that he needed to include both, even if they don't always square up 100% with each other, or even if they create then a disjointed type of reading for his audience. This is a very important aspect of the biblical text that we need to give some great thought. Getting the facts straight was not the highest priority of these ancient scribes. Honoring diverse traditions was. Um, so just maybe a moment, I can just spend a moment on this. I'm not an expert on this, but from what I have read, it seems quite obvious that a lot of the traditions of the Israelites came from two places. Some of them came from the north and some of them came from the south. South was the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin, and the north were the 10 northern tribes. And that when these nations came together, and eventually they kind of did, and as we know archaeologically, the northern 10 tribes, after the Assyrian exile, those who remained came down into Judah. We have archaeological evidence of that happening. Then some of those traditions came with them. And so basically the scribes in the 7th and 6th century, maybe even later, they sat with two traditions on many things. And because the nation was now a combination of Judahites and Israelites, if we can call them that, north and south, south and north, they wanted to honor both traditions. And that seems to be the reason why so often we have more than one version of a story, or what we call a doublet. Without understanding this, you're really going to run into a lot of trouble in the ancient or in the Hebrew Bible, because this happens all the time. And this is also, as far as I understand, it forms part of the understanding of the documentary hypothesis, which is the leading theory on how the Bible, specifically the Hebrew Bible, came together, being multiple traditions coming together. Okay, so what further supports the theory of different traditions is not simply repetitions, right, but the differences between these repeated episodes, seen most clearly in the two passages describing the festival of unleavened bread. So this is in 12:14:20 and 13:3:10. To be sure, the gist is of course the same, but the emphasis and language are very different, suggesting they originate from two different traditions. Tradition B, for example, is clearly focused on the festival's timetable. In tradition A, that information only gets two verses. Instead, tradition A focuses on reminding future generations about the significance of the festival and on establishing a type of a sign to help them remember it and to keep it. Both of these elements are missing from tradition B. Theoretically, we could explain this phenomena as a single writer, giving one take. Let me just rephrase this. Theoretically, we could explain this as a single writer, right? Giving one take on the festival, moving on to other topics, and then later coming back and giving us a slightly different take on the festival. But why would an author actually do that? Also, the patterns of vocabulary in these two takes are consistent patterns of vocabulary that are also seen elsewhere in the Pentateuch. And the point is that there is so many of these doublets, number one, but number two, that they seem to organize themselves into groups, and they do that in other words into two separate traditions at least. And the way they do that is by, or how scholars pick up on this, is the type of words that are used in a certain tradition. For instance, we've mentioned the idea that Sinai is called Mount Sinai, but also Mount Horeb. And Jethro has multiple names, of course, as well. God has multiple names, even in the very early books of chapters of Genesis. And it seems like there's a trend. And I have spent a bit of time on checking up on this and to see, because at first I was terribly skeptical of this type of an approach. Because just looking at isolated cases, like for instance this case, seems a little bit unconvincing, and it did very much so to me as well. But it's only in the greater body of the evidence that it seems like it's highly improbable that these are not multiple traditions. So obviously that's not something we could really do here. But if you want to learn a little bit more about this, you could look up the documentary hypothesis. Now, there are many versions of this, but you'll get the central gist of it. And the central gist of the documentary hypothesis is multiple authors. And we can trace these characteristics of each tradition through multiple books of the Old Testament as well. So it's a very interesting study, and it's worth doing. The only reason why I'm mentioning this is if you never do it and have a look at it in detail, I guess you are going to always be unconvinced by looking at single cases. So I'm a skeptical person by nature to some degree, and I was very skeptical of this until I looked at the larger body of evidence, and then it just became clear to me that that's exactly what's going on here. All right, so for example, tradition A instructs the Israelites to celebrate the festival during the month of Abib, right? And this we can also see in chapter 23:15 and chapter 34:18. Abib is an older name that after the Babylon exile was called Nisan. So this is something we can trace. A particular month is called Abib in the older documents or in the older tradition. And then after the Babylonian exile, the month's name is changed to the month of Nisan. Now, this is a little bit important information, I guess, if you want to study the months or whatever. But the point is that you could then trace what tradition comes kind of, there's a distinction that comes depending on what name they use for the month, right? And at first it might seem like it's just coincidence or the nilly-willy impulses of the author, but like I said, in the larger body of evidence, it becomes quite clear that we're dealing with different sources, really, at the end of the day. All right, so where am I? All right, here I am. Now, it just so happens that throughout the Pentateuch, and this is a point of body of evidence, throughout the Pentateuch, tradition A tends to use older language than tradition B. So this is something scholars can trace quite easily. They know when language is older and when language is newer, because languages evolves and they leave little markers for us along the timeline. And so it seems like, at least, that tradition A, we just call them tradition A and B. These actually have real names, but we'll keep it simple here. Tradition A tends to use older language than tradition B. So we see that pop up here again. Okay, so, and while we're at it, there are also some differences in the way in which tradition A and tradition B describes the Passover. For instance, tradition B focuses on when the Passover was to be celebrated, while tradition A focuses on instruction and instructing the children about the Passover. And this aligns with each tradition's version of the festival of unleavened bread as well, right? So tradition B requires that the sacrificial lamb, a goat or whatever, should be without blemish, a year-old male, and it specifies how it should be prepared. This type of ritualistic information is very typical of tradition B. So I'm taking a wild guess at this, and don't hold me to this, but I'm assuming that this aligns with the priestly source. So there are many sources that predominant sources that have been highlighted by the documentary hypothesis, and one of them is the priestly source, and this is one that's always I'm not infatuated, but populated by things that priests find very, very important. In this case, for instance, the ritualistic details. That's very typical to tradition B. Tradition A instructs a family to select a lamb, slaughter it, brush the blood on the doorpost and the lintels. No instructions are given for how to prepare it or what type of lamb should be blemished or unblemished. So you can just see this, the characteristic of these sources are quite different. Excuse me. If we examine other places in the Bible that describe the Passover, we can even see more voices represented there. According to Exodus 12:8-9, tradition B as we've called it, the Passover lamb is to be roasted over fire and not, explicitly said, not eaten raw or boiled, right? The meal is to be celebrated in each household. But according to Deuteronomy 16:6-7, however, the lamb is to be boiled and not roasted. Now, these type of obviously different traditions, but they are in such tension, I would go as far as to say they contradict one another quite clearly and explicitly in this case. In Deuteronomy, the lamb is to be boiled. It's not supposed to be roasted. Like, it's exactly the opposite. And it's to be eaten in the temple. So Deuteronomy comes from what we call the Deuteronomic source. I think it's the right word. And one of the characteristics of the Deuteronomic source is that it wants to center everything in the temple. And so it moves there's an evolution of these festivals that takes place within the Bible itself. For instance, in this case, we see don't roast it, boil it, don't eat it in your house, eat it in the temple. All right, let's move on. Right. Moreover, according to Exodus 12-13, as well as Leviticus 23:5-6, and Numbers 9:1-14, the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread are actually separate celebrations. But elsewhere, Deuteronomy, Chronicles, which is a much later book than the Pentateuch, maybe by at least, well, I'm taking a wild guess here, but probably between 300 and 400 years. Sorry, I might be wrong on that, but it's centuries, right? It's different. They combined into one event. So it seems like there's a clear evolution of the instructions that are giving for this. And that's exactly what you would expect from a people that are changing themselves and are going through different stages and different eras. And so their laws also need to adjust. It's just that we need to be aware of this and we need to factor this in when we are dealing with the Bible. Now, this is not a devotional reading, and this is not a devotional study, But this type of information should inform devotional or dogmatic study. So you can't get dogmatic about a roasted lamb, because in another place it says the lamb is boiled. So to build a sermon on the fact that the lamb is roasted, it's going to be a problem. So we have to allow this understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, multiple traditions, not written by Moses, written centuries later. It has to inform our dogmatic or our devotional reading of the scriptures, so that we don't do stupid things and say stupid things, as we all do from time to time. Now, all of which is to say that hearing multiple voices speak to us from the past is part of what it means to read the Bible. Okay, now let's move on to the 10th plague. The 10th plague is the final blow to the Egyptians, right? This is the knockout, absolute knockout. The 10th plague touches the Egyptians in a way that no other plague touches them. When you touch someone's son, it's in some ways, you know, in the old times, touching a firstborn son, the one who is double portioned, the one who is supposed to continue the legacy, at least first legacy of the family. It's almost worse than touching the parent itself. It's the knockout punch. It's God's climatic punishment that fits their crime. What was their crime? Well, beyond the slavery that they put the Israelites in, the Egyptians, at some point, if you recall, they were throwing the baby boys of the Israelites into the river. And so this is payback, right? One of the Psalms says God was making a way for his anger. Now, this is one of the things you need to come to terms with, that in the book of Exodus, God is portrayed as rather vindictive. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I've come to the conclusion that the vindictive nature of God that is portrayed in Exodus is rather a result of the vindictive nature of the humans that wrote these accounts. I think that's the simplest way. It has the best explanatory power, and it makes a lot of sense to me today. Of course, that's not what you want to hear when you've held to a type of a sola scriptura mentality all your life, and it can actually be painful and a fearful place to process the information, but that each to his own, as they say. Okay, so the 10th plague affects every household in Egypt, from Pharaoh down to the very lowest slaves, but the Israelites are kept safe, right? My word. God will make a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The distinction will be made by the blood of the Passover lamb that has to be sprinkled on the doorposts and the lintels. Maybe you've never thought about that. Oh, let me just don't skip ahead. But anyway, in preparation for the plague, the Israelites are to ask the Egyptian neighbors, for objects of silver and gold, which it seems, according to the narrative, these people are happy to hand over. These precious metals come in very handy when they build the temple later, but also when they're going to be building the golden bull, golden calf, or whatever you want to call it, which happens in chapter 32. Now, when we get to chapter 32, please, you can miss all the episodes, but don't miss the episode of the golden bull. It's one of the most interesting parts of the entire book of Exodus, and once again shows us what we're dealing with when we're dealing with a book like Exodus. Now, anyway, the Egyptian officials bowed down before Moses, right? They beg him to leave, basically, 11:1. Pharaoh would also be possibly convinced, but as we've discussed before, Exodus 11:9 says, God hardens his heart in order that my wonder may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And this is a real moral conundrum, and has been for me for a very long time. This guy is ready to bow and ready to let everyone go and basically obey, but God hardens his heart so he can punish him more. Once again, I think we've got a human hand in this. It's a human filter, human emotions coming into play in the story here. Okay, I'll leave it at that. And this is what God said from the beginning, right? He told Moses in Exodus 7, 1 to 5. That's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to keep on hardening his heart. And that's then, of course, what happens. So this entire climax of the plagues, this 10th plague is covered only in one verse, in Exodus 12, verse 29. We would expect there to be a little bit more meat around the bones for such an important plague such as this. Let me read it for you, Exodus 12, 29. At midnight, the Lord, or Yahweh, struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. All right. So there's a loud cry in Egypt. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron, and he orders them to leave. And that's it. The editor then uses, what I mean by saying that's it, that's all we have of this massive final knockout. The editor then uses this climactic moment, this real climax in the whole Exodus episode, to tie this event to the Passover. And so it seems to be very important that the Passover ritual is tied to the leaving from Exodus. And obviously for later generations, this would be the way in which they would remember it, they would honor it, and they would recite it in some way through having the Passover feast, which they still do to today, of course. Okay. So clearly what lies at the heart of this passage is how future generations will come to remember the Passover. How to answer when your children ask you, chapter 12, verse 26 says. This future focus indicates that the story, along with the rest of Exodus, was composed at a much later time. It's people standing at a much later time, looking back, telling a story, and kind of in a way explaining why they are doing the Passover ritual, I guess. How much later? Well, we've dealt with this, but we're at least looking at a time that's after the Israeli kingdom that was established by David, right? At least. In other words, Exodus story of the Passover is really about the importance of the past for later generations, connecting the past to the present. When I say present, I mean the time in which it was written. That's what drove the ancient scribes to take the time and to write all of this down in the first place. They were writing to explain how their past impacts their present. The Passover ceremony will keep the memory alive, and it's done. That's exactly what it was meant to do, and it's exactly what it did. Here we are, me and you. Well, I'm a South African, and I'm talking about Israelite Passover, right? So, but what exactly is the Passover lamb ceremony about? Well, it seems like it's about the idea, because beyond just it being the way or the ceremony that leads them out, it seems to be signaling something else as well. Now, there's this ancient concept, and it's not only found in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, it's also possibly found in other nations around them or much earlier time. But as you know, human sacrifice is not something that we are oblivious to. We know that this type of thing happened in very ancient societies, and many times these sacrifices of children were made to appease the gods. Now, it seems that at least at this point, the Israelites were trying to move away from this, as many of the prophets, of course, also indicated. But the notion remained that the firstborn of the cattle and all that, but we're interested in the children, the firstborn of the children, they belong to God. And when an animal has a firstborn, you slaughter it. But when a human has a firstborn, you can redeem it. But ultimately, it still belongs to God. And it seems like this is the underlying substrate for this narrative, that the firstborn belongs to God anyway. And in the case of the Egyptians, he's just coming to take them. And in the case of the Israelites, the Passover lamb is going to be a substitute for the kids of the Israelites. And this brings us to a very interesting little point, that if an Israelite family couldn't get hold of a lamb or forgot to put the blood on their doorpost, their firstborn would die that night. And it's a bit of a mystery, really. And one wants to ask the question, but, I mean, does God not know the difference between an Israelite and an Egyptian? I mean, can't he just kill all the Egyptian kids and not kill the Israeli kids? Why do the Israelis have to go through this ritual of substitution, sacrificial substitution, in order for their kids and not to be killed? It seems a bit silly that the all-knowing God of the universe needs a sign to show him who to kill and who not to. It seems strange, but the point is that it is unnecessary unless it is really necessary. And in this case, it seems like it is really necessary because it has this idea in it that all the first actually belong to God and he can come and take it whenever he wants. And you need to at least do some form of redemption for your firstborn. As we know later on, we'll read in Leviticus that the Israelites actually had to do that. And it was part of Israelite tradition that when you have a firstborn child, you would redeem it by killing something else. And so this was very much ingrained in Israelite consciousness that the first belonged to God. All right, let's leave it at that for now. Why do the Israelites need some sign for God to spare them? Why would they be in danger in the first place, right? So it seems like it's an excuse to put this idea onto paper. Why can't God distinguish between Egyptians and the Israelites like he did with the other plagues, for instance? Or by just using his all-knowingness and simply choose not to attack them? Well, the answer to these questions is not so simple, but it seems to boil down to this. All the firstborn of all the nations and animals belong to God. That's it. That's the principle upon which this seemed to be built, which means they need to be sacrificed as an offering to God. And God actually requires firstborn of the children of Israel, as I've said, to be redeemed with livestock to some degree. But this is an interesting thing, a little interesting concept, because things were not always like this. We remember then Abraham. God requires Isaac to be offered, Abraham's firstborn son by at least his wife. And then God himself provides a substitute in the form of a ram. We also then have this very old commandment that we find in Exodus 22, 29 to 30. And it says the following: the firstborn of all your sons you will give to me. Now, right. What does that mean? Well, by the context of ancient world, that doesn't mean give them so they can come to, like, what does it mean to give your firstborn son? It means to kill him. That's what it means here. He says, and you will do the same with your oxen, with your sheep. 7 days it will remain with his mother. On the 8th day, you will give it to me. So there's this undertone here in Exodus that there seems to be a memory, and I've mentioned this before now today, but I just want to say it again, that a very pagan idea that actually first is, I don't want to say the wrong words here, but this is an instruction to sacrifice your children. That's what that is. There's no other way to really read that logically. But it seems like the God of Israel, the Israelites moved on from this very ancient idea to the idea of substitution, so that kids didn't have to be sacrificed. And obviously, and I understand, and I can hear you shouting at me, the prophets were against this type of idea of sacrificing of children, and we know that. But there is a very good chance that the most ancient of Israelites kind of that they might have done this type of thing, right? And it was later outlawed. But anyway, we leave it at that. Now, perhaps we can understand why this section of Exodus ends up with God's command to consecrate the firstborn. In killing the firstborn of Egypt, God is exercising God's right to the firstborn. And by accepting the substitute blood of the Lamb, God chooses not to exercise his right upon the Israelites. And when they sacrificed the firstborn of their livestock and redeemed their firstborn sons by celebrating Passover, the future descendants of these original Israelites will actually in some way be partaking in the redemption of their ancestors. In this section, the focus has been on the ritual remembrance or the ritual afterlife, not got nothing to do with after you die, but of the story of Exodus from Egypt. The regulations and the yearly festivals to be celebrated by future generations. Now, in our next session, we are going to turn to the departure of the Israelites themselves, their journey to Sinai, and the reason for their deliverance. Right, I'm going to leave you there today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you're finding this a little bit helpful. Sometimes we need to just take some time in these things to understand better, and it's not always exciting stuff, but it does bring us closer to understanding what's really going on in our Bibles. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you next week. Cheers.